This is the story of Inex-Adria 1308. Now, on November the 29th in 1989, a Tupolev 134 was to fly from Zagreb to Frankfurt with a stopover in Ljubljana. On board were 13 crew and 128 passengers. At 9:19 p.m., the crew received a weather report for Ljubljana stating that there were thunderstorms in the area. The controller then asked if they wanted to be put on a different route that would take them around some of the bad weather. The pilots said that they would like to hold at their current position until the weather at Ljubljana improved, so the controller let them know that they would be in contact as soon as the weather cleared up. But before we go into what happened next, now, back to the video. At 9:26 p.m., the crew of a 1308 were informed that the weather at Ljubljana had cleared and that they could proceed for an ILS approach to runway 29. As the plane got closer to the airport, the first officer put the plane into a left bank because there was a small amount of turbulence and he wanted to alleviate that. However, during this maneuver, the ground proximity warning system came on and the pilots immediately responded by banking the plane back to the right. It seemed as though they had pulled back too hard because the nose of the aircraft went through the clouds and into a descent. They were way too low for the approach and they were rapidly losing altitude. In an attempt to level off, the pilots pushed the engines to max power, but the damage had already been done. The plane overran the end of the runway and they were out of runway 1308. The plane had impacted a fence at the end of the runway and it had severed the fuel lines of the plane. Fuel started pouring onto the runway and the wreckage of the plane. It caught fire almost immediately after. Now, all 141 people on board were killed. But what caused this crash? Well, we don't really know. And that's the weird part. You see, in the official investigation, they couldn't determine the cause of the accident. This was one of the deadliest crashes involving the Tupolev 134 and the worst crash in Slovenia's history. But what really caused the crash? Was it pilot error, mechanical failure, or something else? Well, we have a few theories. One is that the pilots might have misidentified the terrain. The mountainous terrain near Ljubljana is covered with tall trees, and this may have misled the pilots into thinking that they were above the decision height. We also need to remember that the pilots had never flown this approach before, and the airport had no VOR beacon, and that the airport at Ljubljana has 2 runways. And the beacons for each runway are about 4 nautical miles apart. The investigators believe that they might have gotten their navigational systems confused, and when they were executing the ILS approach, they might have been following the wrong radial line. This would explain why they were so low during the approach, because if they were following the wrong radial line, then they would have been descending into the mountains rather than the runway. Another theory is that they might have been victims of spatial disorientation. As we mentioned earlier, the mountainous terrain is covered with thick trees, which means that they wouldn't have had any visual cues to tell how high they were. Also, the night was very dark and it was raining heavily, which made things worse. The only thing that they could see was the instruments. If they had misread the instruments, then that would have led to this disaster. Now, on top of that, the crew had made a few mistakes during the approach. For example, the pilots were not talking to each other. That's usually a good indicator of pilot monitoring, and the fact that the plane was banking shortly before the impact suggests that neither pilot was in control of the plane. Instead, the plane was being flown by someone else. But who was that someone else? Well, that's where the story gets a bit creepy. You see, one of the passengers on board was a man named Miroslav Klopfer. He was a successful businessman and he was considered to be very wealthy. He had multiple businesses in Yugoslavia, and he had interests in real estate, agriculture, and even mining. But he was much more than just a businessman. See, growing up, he always wanted to be a pilot. In fact, during World War II, he trained to be a fighter pilot, and he even flew a few missions. But once the war was over, he was grounded. But he still had a passion for flying. Throughout his life, he kept up with aviation. He would talk to pilots and he would look at planes whenever he could, and every once in a while he would go up in a small plane just to get a feel of what it's like to fly. But he always wanted to fly big planes. He wanted to fly jets. But unfortunately, his career didn't really allow him to do that. So he turned to the next best thing. He would hire pilots to fly planes for him. He would pay them, and then he would go along for the ride. This is exactly what he was doing on the fateful day that Inex-1308 crashed. He had hired the pilots to take him from Zagreb to Ljubljana. And when the pilots refused to land at Ljubljana due to the bad weather, he was fine with that. He didn't mind waiting, but when the pilots decided to make an approach to Ljubljana, he was against it. When they were flying through the cloud, he told the pilots to pull up because he felt as though they were too low, but they didn't listen, and then they crashed. The investigators found out that Klaus Bauer had taken control of the plane and was manually flying the plane during the approach. But who was the pilot monitoring? Well, according to the official report, the captain was acting as the pilot monitoring, but the data recorder didn't really agree with that. The data recorder showed that the pilots were talking to each other in the cockpit, and they were calling each other by their names. So the captain wasn't in the right place to monitor the pilot flying. And the first officer was busy responding to the warnings given by the GPWS. So it seems as though nobody was monitoring the pilot flying. But was there anybody in the cockpit besides Clover and the pilots? Well, apparently there was. You see, the plane took off from Zagreb with 128 passengers and 13 crew members. And when it crashed, only 140 bodies were found. Where was the 141st person? Well, her name was Danijela Dobersek, and she was a flight attendant on board Inex-1308. She had gotten on the plane in Zagreb and she was sitting in the jump seat in the cockpit. But when the plane crashed, her body was nowhere to be found. But there was something strange about her. You see, 2 days before the accident, she had taken a taxi to the airport. She had asked the taxi driver to wait for her for 2 hours because she had a flight to catch. But when the time was up, she didn't return. Instead, the taxi driver got a call from the airline saying that Danijela would not be showing up. The airline said that she had called in sick. But later on, the airline admitted that she was scheduled to fly from Ljubljana to Frankfurt, not Ljubljana to Zagreb. And since she never showed up, she didn't get on the plane in Zagreb. So where did she go? Did she decide not to fly? Did she get on another flight? Or was she hijacking this flight? Because here's the thing. The pilot and the co-pilot both stated that they had seen Danijela get on the plane in Zagreb, but everybody else stated that they had seen her at Ljubljana. So where did she really get on the plane? And why wasn't she on the plane that departed Ljubljana? We know that she was at the Ljubljana Airport because security cameras caught her walking through the terminal. In fact, a witness saw her enter the cockpit and talk to the crew. But when the plane was getting ready to depart, she went back to the gate and she was nowhere to be seen again until the plane crashed. In conclusion, the investigators couldn't figure out what really happened on that flight. All they knew was that somebody had taken control of the plane and had flown it into the mountain. There was no evidence of a struggle in the cabin, so nobody had fought back against the hijacker. And there was no evidence that the pilots had fought back either. But why didn't they fight back? Were they scared of Clover? Were they paid off? Or were they accomplices? Well, we'll probably never know. But that is the story of what really happened to Inex-Adria 1308. Do you think that passenger was a hijacker? Why do you think they didn't fight back? Let me know your thoughts, but thank you for watching. If you want to watch more videos like this, please stay tuned. But I will catch you guys next time. Stay safe.